"No one here understands what they just did," the man said, his voice calm but cutting through the noise like a sudden silence no one expected. And in that instant, every head turned, every whisper died, every smirk faded just enough to reveal something else underneath, something closer to doubt. Because standing there in the middle of a polished shopping mall that smelled like new leather and expensive perfume was William Carter, a man most of them did not recognize yet, but somehow, instinctively knew carried weight, the kind of presence that made people pause without knowing why. And just a few feet away from him stood Ava Johnson, a young girl no older than 10, her hands tucked close to her sides, as if she could fold herself smaller, her eyes fixed on the ground, as though it might open up and let her disappear, her sneakers worn thin with frayed edges, and a small tear near the toe that she kept angling away from view. But it had already been seen, already pointed out, already turned into something for others to laugh at. Because moments earlier a few shoppers had noticed her lingering outside a high-end shoe store, glancing through the glass at rows of pristine sneakers lined up like trophies. And it started with one comment, quiet but sharp, followed by a second voice that found it funny, then another that made it louder, until the space filled with that uncomfortable kind of laughter that spreads too easily when no one stops it. And Ava had not said a word. Not when someone asked if she got lost. Not when another joked about how those shoes probably had stories older than the building itself. She just stood there, shifting her weight slightly, trying to cover the tear with the edge of her other foot, trying to hold on to whatever dignity she had left in a place that clearly was not built for someone like her. And inside the store, a sales associate noticed the scene but chose to look away, adjusting a display instead, pretending the moment did not belong to them, because it was easier that way, easier than stepping in, easier than risking discomfort, and all of it unfolded in under 5 minutes, quick enough for most people to forget, quick enough for the crowd to move on. Except William Carter did not move. He had been standing near the entrance the entire time, watching, not with anger at first, but with something deeper, something reflective, like he was seeing more than just a girl in worn shoes, like he was remembering something buried beneath years of success and polished reputation, something that looked a lot like the same silence Ava was holding on to now. And when he finally stepped forward, it was not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. Each step measured until he stood close enough that the distance between them felt intentional. And that was when he spoke, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a certainty that did not need volume to carry. And suddenly the laughter stopped, not because they were told to stop, but because something in his tone made it impossible to continue. And Ava slowly lifted her eyes, unsure of what was happening, unsure of who he was, but sensing that whatever came next was not going to be like what had just happened, because the way he looked at her was different, not with pity, not with judgment, but with recognition, as if in that crowded, indifferent place, someone had finally decided to see her, and no one there was ready for what that meant. William Carter did not rush his next words, and that was what made the moment feel heavier than anything anyone had said before, because instead of reacting to the noise that had just faded, he let the silence stretch long enough for people to feel it, to sit in it, to recognize what had just happened without needing it explained. And then he shifted his attention slightly toward the store entrance where the sales associate still stood frozen between stepping forward and staying invisible. And with a calm, steady voice, he said that every customer who walks through that door deserves respect, no matter what they are wearing or where they come from. And it was not loud, but it carried the kind of statement that lands deeper because it sounds like a simple truth that everyone forgot at the exact same time. And the associate nodded quickly, almost relieved to be told what to do, stepping forward now with a different posture, one that tried to repair what had already been broken. And Ava hesitated, her feet still planted where they had been, because moments like this do not turn around easily for someone who has already been made to feel small. And William noticed that hesitation, the way her shoulders remained slightly drawn in, the way her hands stayed close as if she was still protecting herself from something that might happen again. And instead of reaching out or making a grand gesture, he simply stepped back half a pace, giving her space, giving her control over the next move. And that small action changed everything, because it told her she was not being pulled into something. She was being invited, and slowly, almost cautiously, Ava took a step forward, then another, her eyes still scanning the faces around her, not for approval but for safety, and the crowd that had once been loud now avoided looking directly at her. Their earlier confidence replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that they had crossed a line, without realizing how far it went. And as Ava reached the doorway, the associate opened it wider, greeting her with a tone that sounded practiced but carried a hint of sincerity now. And inside the store the lighting felt warmer, quieter, a different world from the one just outside. But Ava did not fully step in yet, because she turned back slightly, her eyes landing on William again, searching for something she could not quite name. And he gave a small nod, not a command, not a signal, just reassurance. And that was enough. She stepped inside, and the moment shifted from public spectacle to something more personal, something that no longer belonged to the crowd. And William followed a few steps behind, not as someone leading the situation, but as someone ensuring it did not fall apart again. And as they moved deeper into the store, the rows of shoes that once felt distant now seemed within reach. But there was still a question hanging in the air, something unspoken, because everyone could sense that this was not just about buying a pair of shoes. There was a reason he stepped in, a reason he stayed calm, a reason his voice carried more than authority, and the truth behind that reason had not been revealed yet, but it was coming, and when it did, it was going to change how every single person in that space understood what they had just witnessed. Inside the store, the noise from outside faded into a soft hum of air conditioning and distant footsteps. And for the first time since she arrived, Ava Johnson stood in a place where no one was laughing. But that did not mean she felt comfortable, because moments like the one she had just gone through do not disappear simply because the environment changes. They linger in the way a person moves, in the way they look at things they believe they cannot have. And Ava's eyes moved slowly across the shelves, taking in rows of perfectly lined sneakers that looked untouched, almost too clean to belong to the same world as her worn pair. And she kept her hands close to her sides as if she was afraid that reaching out might somehow break something or draw attention again. And the sales associate stepped forward with a polite smile, asking what size she wore, but Ava hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because she was not used to being asked that question in a place like this. And before she could respond, William Carter spoke gently, not interrupting but supporting, saying that she could take her time and look around, that there was no rush. And the way he said it removed pressure instead of adding to it. And Ava nodded slightly, her voice barely above a whisper as she gave her size. And the associate moved quickly now, bringing out a few options, placing them carefully on a bench as if the moment required extra attention. And Ava sat down slowly, glancing once more at her own shoes before reaching toward the new ones, her fingers brushing the surface lightly as if she was confirming they were real. And as she began to try them on, something shifted again, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough that William noticed, because the tension in her shoulders eased just a little, the kind of change that only happens when someone begins to feel a small sense of belonging, even if it is temporary. And he remained standing a short distance away, watching, quietly, not wanting to turn the moment into something larger than it needed to be yet, because he understood that what mattered right now was not what he could give her, but how she experienced this moment for herself. And while the associate offered suggestions and adjusted the fit, Ava stood up in a new pair, taking a careful step forward, then another, testing the feel, her expression still guarded but no longer closed. And for a brief second, she looked at her reflection in the mirror, and something there caught her attention, not the shoes themselves, but the way she stood, slightly straighter, slightly more certain, and William saw it too. That subtle change, that quiet shift in confidence that no one else in the store fully recognized. And it brought something back to him, a memory he had not spoken about in years, something tied to a moment when he had once stood in a similar place, feeling just as out of place, just as unsure. And as that memory surfaced, it became clear that this was not where the story ended, because the reason he stepped in was deeper than kindness alone. It was connected to a part of his past that no one here knew about yet. And as Ava turned slightly, still unaware of what was about to be revealed, William took a small breath, preparing to say something that would shift the entire meaning of what had just happened from a simple act into something far more personal. William Carter stepped a little closer, not enough to interrupt the quiet moment Ava was having in front of the mirror, but enough that his presence could be felt without being overwhelming. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different weight than before, softer yet more personal. as if he was no longer addressing the situation but revealing something that had been held back for years. And he said that a long time ago he had stood in a place very much like this, not as someone who could buy anything he wanted, but as someone who knew exactly what it felt like to count every dollar, to wonder if he even belonged inside. And Ava turned her head slightly, listening now, not out of obligation, but because something in his tone made it impossible to ignore, and the associate paused as well, sensing that this moment had shifted beyond a simple purchase. And William continued, explaining that he had grown up in a small apartment where new shoes were not something you expected. They were something you hoped for, sometimes for months, sometimes longer, and he described how he used to walk past store windows just like this one, looking in, imagining what it would feel like to step inside without worrying about being judged, without worrying about being turned away. And as he spoke, the details did not sound exaggerated or dramatic. They sounded real, grounded, the kind of truth that does not need to be embellished because it already carries enough weight. And Ava's expression changed again, this time not just from curiosity, but from recognition, because even though their lives were not identical, the feeling he described was something she understood deeply, and the distance between them, which at first seemed defined by wealth and status, began to shrink in a way no one in the store expected. And William did not rush the story. He let each word settle, giving space for it to be felt rather than just heard. And then he added something that shifted the energy even further, saying that the day he finally got his first pair of new shoes was not just about the shoes themselves. It was about how someone chose to see him when he thought no one would. And that simple act changed the way he saw himself. Not overnight, not magically, but enough to believe that his future could be different from his present. And as those words hung in the air, the meaning behind everything that had just happened started to become clear, not just to Ava, but to everyone within earshot. Because this was no longer about correcting a moment of disrespect. It was about continuing something that had once been given to him, something he never forgot. And Ava looked down at the shoes she was wearing now, then back up at him, her eyes no longer uncertain, but searching for understanding. And William met that look with a quiet certainty, as if to say that what came next was not charity. It was a choice rooted in experience. And as the room remained still, waiting without realizing it, the next words he was about to say would turn this moment from a reflection of the past into something that could shape her future in ways no one there could fully predict. William Carter let the silence linger for a moment longer, not because he was unsure of what to say, but because he understood that timing mattered, that some words only carry weight when they are allowed to arrive without interruption. And when he finally continued, his voice remained steady, but there was a quiet conviction beneath it that made every word feel intentional. And he said that the person who helped him back then did not give him everything. They gave him a chance, a moment that showed him he was not invisible. And that was what stayed with him long after the shoes wore out. And Ava listened closely now, no longer guarded in the same way, because what he was describing did not feel distant or unreachable. It felt like something that could belong to her too. And William took a small step closer, still keeping that respectful space. And he said that today was not about fixing what happened outside, because that moment could not be undone, but it could be answered with something better, something stronger. And he looked at the associate briefly before returning his attention to Ava, making it clear without needing to say it that what came next was not limited by the price of anything in the store. And then he asked her a simple question: what kind of shoes do you really like? Not what she needed, not what was practical, but what she liked. And that question caught her off guard in a way nothing else had, because she was not used to being asked about her preference in a place like this. And for a second she hesitated, as if she was checking whether she was allowed to answer honestly. And when she finally spoke, her voice was still soft but more certain, describing a pair she had seen in the window, something bright and clean and different from anything she had ever owned. And William nodded, not surprised, not judging, just acknowledging. And he told the associate to bring that exact pair. And as they moved to retrieve it, the atmosphere in the store shifted again, this time with a quiet anticipation, because everyone present could sense that this was building towards something more than a purchase. And when the shoes were placed in front of her, Ava reached out with a steadier hand than before, trying them on carefully, standing up once more. And this time when she looked at her reflection, there was a noticeable change, not just in how she stood, but in how she saw herself. And William observed that transformation without interrupting it, because he knew that confidence does not come from being told something. It comes from feeling it in a moment that feels real. And after giving her time, he spoke again, saying that she could keep those shoes. But he did not stop there, because the story he was continuing was never about just one moment. It was about what that moment could lead to. And as he paused briefly, choosing his next words carefully, it became clear that what he was about to offer would go beyond what anyone in that store expected, something that would connect this moment to a future that Ava had not yet imagined. And the weight of that possibility began to settle in, not just for her, but for everyone who was still quietly watching, realizing that they were witnessing something that would not be forgotten once they walked away. William Carter did not rush into the next part, even though everyone in the store could feel that something more was coming, because he understood that moments like this were not meant to be filled with speed, they were meant to be felt completely. And as Ava stood there in her new shoes, shifting her weight slightly, as if still adjusting to the unfamiliar comfort, he let her experience that feeling fully before adding anything else. And when he finally spoke again, his tone remained calm but carried a deeper sense of purpose. And he said that a single moment can change how a person sees themselves, but what truly matters is what happens after that moment, because that is where real change begins. And Ava looked at him more directly now, no longer unsure of whether she should engage, but curious, attentive, and ready to listen. And William continued by explaining that when someone gave him that first chance years ago, it was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a path that required effort, belief, and support. And he emphasized that belief was something that had to be built, not given instantly. And as he spoke, the associate and the few remaining customers in the store stood quietly, aware that they were witnessing something far more meaningful than a simple act of generosity. And then William asked Ava another question, one that shifted the focus away from the present moment and toward her future, asking her what she liked to do, what made her excited, what she thought about when she imagined growing up. And the question caught her by surprise again. But this time she did not hesitate as long, because something about the way he asked made it feel safe to answer honestly. And she spoke about school, about subjects she enjoyed, about small dreams that had never been fully voiced before. And as she spoke, her confidence grew with each word, not dramatically, but enough that it could be seen in the way she held herself. And William listened carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, simply giving her the space to be heard. And when she finished, he nodded with genuine interest, as if her words carried real value. And then he said that opportunities are not always easy to find, but when they appear, they should be taken seriously, because they can open doors that were never visible before. And he paused briefly, allowing that idea to settle, and then he added something that shifted the moment once again, saying that if she was willing to work hard and stay focused, he wanted to help create more than just a single good day for her. He wanted to be part of giving her a real chance to move forward. And the way he said it made it clear that this was not a casual offer. It was something thoughtful, something intentional, something that extended beyond the walls of the store. And Ava's expression changed again, this time reflecting a mix of surprise and cautious hope, because what she was hearing was bigger than anything she expected. And as the weight of that possibility began to settle in, it became clear that this moment was no longer just about what had already happened. It was about what could happen next, and that realization carried a quiet intensity that no one present could ignore. Ava Johnson did not answer right away, not because she did not want to, but because what William Carter had just offered did not feel like something that fit into the world she was used to. And for a moment she simply stood there, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the bench as if she needed something steady to hold on to while she processed it. And her eyes moved briefly across the store, not searching for approval anymore, but trying to understand whether this moment was real or something that would disappear the second she stepped outside again. And William remained still, giving her that time without pressure, because he understood that trust does not form instantly, especially not after what she had experienced just minutes earlier. And the associate stood quietly nearby, no longer just an employee in the background, but someone now aware of the weight of what was happening. And even the few customers who had lingered found themselves drawn into the silence again, not out of curiosity this time, but out of a sense that something meaningful was unfolding. And finally Ava spoke, her voice still soft but steadier than before, asking what he meant when he said he wanted to help. And it was a simple question, but it carried everything, because it showed that she was willing to listen, willing to consider that this moment could lead somewhere beyond the present. And William nodded slightly, acknowledging the importance of that question, and he explained that help does not always come in one form. It can be guidance, it can be support, it can be creating opportunities that were not there before, and he made it clear that he was not offering something temporary or something that would fade after today. He was offering a connection, a way forward that would depend on her willingness to take each step with effort and commitment. And as he spoke, his tone remained grounded, not exaggerated, not overwhelming, just honest, and that honesty made it easier for Ava to believe that what he was saying was real, and she listened carefully, absorbing each word. And for the first time since she entered the mall, the uncertainty in her expression began to shift into something else, something that looked like cautious belief, and she asked another question, this time more directly, asking why he would do this for her. And that question caused a brief pause, not because he did not have an answer, but because he wanted it to be understood clearly. And when he responded, he did not speak about success or wealth or anything that separated them. He spoke about responsibility, about remembering where he came from and recognizing moments where he could make a difference. And he said that sometimes the right thing to do is not complicated. It is simply choosing to act when others choose not to. And as those words settled in, Ava looked down briefly at her new shoes, then back up at him. And something in her posture changed again, more noticeable now, as if she was standing not just with new shoes, but with a new sense of possibility. And while the path ahead was still unknown, the fear that had been there earlier was no longer in control, replaced instead by a quiet willingness to see what could come next. And in that moment it became clear that what had started as a difficult situation had turned into something that carried the potential to shape her future in ways that extended far beyond anything that had happened inside that store. William Carter watched the shift in Ava Johnson's expression with quiet attention, recognizing that something important had just changed, not in the environment around them, but within her. And he knew that this was the exact moment where a person either steps forward into possibility or retreats back into what feels safe. And he did not want to rush her into a decision. But he also understood that hesitation could allow doubt to return. So he spoke again with the same steady tone, telling her that she did not need to decide everything right now, that all he was asking was for her to be open to what could come next. And that simple framing made the situation feel less overwhelming, less like a life-changing commitment, and more like a step she could take at her own pace. And Ava listened carefully, her eyes focused now not with uncertainty, but with a growing sense of awareness. And she nodded slowly, not as a full answer, but as an acknowledgement that she was willing to consider what he was offering. And that small gesture carried more meaning than anything she could have said, and William recognized it immediately, understanding that trust often begins with something as simple as that. And he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple card, not flashy, not designed to impress, just a clean piece of information that represented a connection beyond this moment. And he held it out toward her without stepping closer, allowing her to choose whether to take it. And Ava looked at the card for a second before reaching out, her hand steady now as she accepted it. And as she glanced down at the name printed on it, the realization of who he was began to settle in, not fully, but enough that she understood this was not an ordinary interaction, and the weight of that understanding did not intimidate her the way it might have earlier, because the way he had spoken, the way he had acted, had already shown her that his presence here was not about status, it was about intention. And he explained briefly that the card would give her a way to reach someone from his team, someone who could help guide her through the next steps, whether it was school support or opportunities that aligned with what she cared about. And he made it clear that nothing would happen without her and her family being involved, that everything would be transparent and respectful. And as he spoke, the structure of what he was offering became clearer, more real, less like a distant idea and more like something that could actually take shape. And Ava listened with full attention now, absorbing not just the words but the tone behind them, the consistency that made it easier to believe this was not temporary. And she held the card carefully, as if it represented more than just contact information, as if it carried the possibility of a different path. And William gave a small nod, not as a conclusion but as reassurance that the next step was hers to take. and in that moment the space between them no longer felt defined by difference. It felt connected by something shared, something that had begun to take form in a way that neither of them could fully predict, but both could recognize as important. And while the store remained quiet around them, the significance of what had just happened continued to build, setting the stage for what would follow once they stepped beyond this moment and into whatever came next. Ava Johnson held the card carefully, her fingers tracing the edge as if she was trying to understand the weight of something that did not feel physical but carried a quiet significance. And for a moment she simply looked at it, not reading every detail yet, but recognizing that it represented a doorway she had never expected to see open. And William Carter watched her reaction without interrupting, because he knew that this was not a moment to guide too closely. It was a moment for her to process, to decide how she felt about what had just been placed in her hands. And the store remained still around them, the earlier tension replaced by a different kind of silence, one that felt reflective rather than uncomfortable. And the associate stepped back slightly, giving them space, no longer trying to manage the situation but simply witnessing it unfold. And Ava finally looked up again, her eyes meeting William's with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something that was still forming. And she asked quietly what she should do next, not because she needed instructions, but because she wanted clarity. And William nodded, understanding that question was not about dependence but about direction. And he explained that the first step was simple: to go home and talk to her family, to share what had happened, to make sure that whatever came next included the people who supported her every day. And he emphasized that nothing needed to be rushed, that real opportunities are built with care, not urgency. And as he spoke, his tone remained steady and grounded, reinforcing the idea that this was not a fleeting offer, but something meant to be approached thoughtfully. And Ava listened closely, absorbing each word, and she nodded again, this time with more certainty, because the path he described did not feel overwhelming. It felt possible, and that difference mattered more than anything else. And William added that once she and her family were ready, they could reach out using the information on the card, and from there his team would help guide the process step by step, ensuring that everything was clear and supportive. And as he said this, he made sure to maintain eye contact, not in a way that pressured her, but in a way that communicated respect, as if he was speaking to someone whose decisions mattered, not someone who was simply receiving help. And that subtle distinction continued to shape how Ava experienced the moment, because she was not being placed in a position of dependency. She was being given a choice, and that choice carried a sense of ownership that began to replace the uncertainty she had felt earlier. And as the conversation settled, William took a small step back, signaling that the moment was shifting toward its natural close, not abruptly but with intention. And Ava looked down at the shoes on her feet once more, then back at the card in her hand, and then at him. And the expression on her face now was no longer defined by hesitation or doubt. It was defined by a quiet determination, the kind that does not announce itself loudly but holds steady beneath the surface. And while no one in that store could fully predict what would happen next, it was clear that something meaningful had begun, something that extended far beyond the walls around them. And as Ava stood there, no longer trying to hide or shrink away, it became evident that this moment would not end when she walked out. It would carry forward into whatever choices she made next, shaping a path that had only just started to reveal itself. William Carter did not extend the moment any further than it needed to go, because he understood that meaning does not come from how long something lasts, but from how deeply it is felt. And as Ava Johnson stood there holding both the card and the sense of possibility that came with it, he gave a final small nod, not as a goodbye, but as a quiet acknowledgement that what needed to happen here had already taken place. And he turned slightly, preparing to leave without creating a scene, without drawing attention back to himself, because his role in this moment was never about being recognized. It was about ensuring that she had what she needed to move forward. And Ava watched him carefully, noticing the way he stepped away with the same calm presence he had arrived with, not waiting for gratitude, not expecting anything in return. And that detail stayed with her more than anything else, because it showed her that what he had done was genuine, not something performed for others. And as he reached the entrance of the store, the associate quietly completed the purchase, placing the box aside as Ava kept the new shoes on her feet. And the simple act of finalizing that exchange felt different now, not transactional, but symbolic, like a marker of where one moment ended and another began, and Ava looked down once more, adjusting her stance, feeling the unfamiliar comfort beneath her steps. And then she looked toward the doorway where William had just stepped out, and for a second she considered following, saying something more, asking one more question, but she stopped herself because she realized that he had already given her what she needed most, not answers, but a direction, and that realization carried a quiet strength that settled in her posture, in the way she held the card, in the way she stood without trying to hide anything anymore. And outside the store, the mall continued as it always did, people moving, conversations blending into the background. But for Ava, the environment no longer felt the same, because something inside her had shifted, something that made the space feel less intimidating and more open. And as she walked toward the exit, each step felt different, not just because of the shoes, but because of what they represented. And when she finally stepped back into the main walkway, the earlier scene felt distant, almost like it had happened to someone else, because the version of herself who stood there now was no longer defined by that moment. And as she moved forward, her attention returned briefly to the card in her hand, and she read the name more carefully this time, recognizing it in a way that brought a new layer of understanding to everything that had just happened. And the significance of that realization did not overwhelm her. It grounded her, because it confirmed that the opportunity she had been given was real. And as she continued walking, blending back into the flow of the crowd, the story did not feel like it had reached an end. It felt like it had just begun, with decisions ahead, conversations to have, and a future that was no longer limited to what she had known before. And somewhere beyond the immediate moment, beyond the walls of the mall, the next chapter was already waiting, shaped by what she chose to do with the chance that had been placed in her hands. Ava Johnson stepped out of the store into the wider space of the mall, and for a moment she slowed her pace, not because she was unsure of where to go, but because everything around her felt slightly different, like the same place viewed through a new perspective, and the sounds that once blended into a background of distraction now seemed clearer, footsteps echoing against polished floors, distant conversations rising and falling, the soft hum of music playing somewhere above, and she held the card a little tighter in her hand, not out of fear of losing it, but because it grounded her in what had just happened. And as she walked, she noticed people again, some passing by without a second glance, others briefly looking at her shoes. But this time those looks did not carry the same weight they had before, because her focus had shifted inward, toward what she now carried with her, and she made her way toward the exit, the automatic doors opening as she approached, letting in a wash of fresh air that felt cooler and more open than the controlled environment inside. And once outside, she paused again, taking a small breath, allowing the moment to settle fully, and her thoughts moved quickly now, not in confusion, but in possibility, thinking about what she would say when she got home, how she would explain everything, how she would show the card, how she would describe the conversation in a way that made it real to someone else. And she knew it would be difficult to put into words, not because it was complicated, but because it meant so much more than it seemed on the surface. And as she continued walking, she adjusted her steps slightly, still getting used to the feel of the new shoes, each movement reinforcing the change that had already begun. And she reached into her pocket briefly, making sure the card was still there, then held it again, almost as if she needed to feel its presence to remind herself that this was not something she imagined. And across the street, cars moved steadily. People carried on with their routines, the world unchanged in its larger sense. But for her, something had shifted in a way that made the future feel less fixed, less predetermined. And that realization carried both excitement and responsibility, because she understood, even at her age, that opportunities come with expectations, not from others alone, but from within. And as she approached her neighborhood, the environment changed. Again, from the polished surfaces of the mall to the familiar streets she knew well. And yet even here, everything felt slightly different, not because the place had changed, but because she had. And when she finally reached her front door, she paused once more, her hand resting lightly against it, taking a moment before stepping inside, because she knew that once she walked through, this story would begin to expand beyond just her. It would involve her family, their reactions, their questions, their decisions. And that next step carried its own weight, its own importance. And as she opened the door and stepped inside, The quiet determination that had formed within her remained steady, guiding her forward into whatever would come next. With the understanding that this was no longer just about a moment in a store, it was about what she would choose to do with everything that had followed. Ava Johnson stepped fully inside her home and gently closed the door behind her. And for a brief moment she stood still, letting the quiet of the space settle around her. A different kind of silence from the one she had experienced earlier. This one familiar, steady, and grounding, and she could hear soft movement from another room. The everyday sounds of home that had not changed even though everything inside her felt different. And she took a few careful steps forward, still aware of the new shoes on her feet, not just because they were new, but because of what they represented. And when her mother noticed her and called her name, Ava responded in a tone that carried something new, something that was not immediately obvious but could be felt in the way she spoke. And as she moved closer, her mother's eyes naturally dropped to the shoes, recognizing instantly that they were not the same worn pair Ava had left with earlier. And there was a moment of confusion, followed by concern, not because of the shoes themselves, but because of what they might mean. And Ava understood that reaction. She expected it. And instead of rushing through her explanation, she took a breath and began from the beginning, describing where she had been, what had happened outside the store, the way people had reacted. And as she spoke, her voice remained steady, not hiding the difficult parts, but also not letting them define the entire story. And then she described William Carter, not as a billionaire at first, but as the person who stepped in when no one else did. The way he spoke, the way he acted, the way he treated her with respect. And as she continued, her mother listened closely, the initial concern shifting into attention, into understanding. And when Ava finally showed the card, holding it out carefully, the weight of the moment became fully clear, because this was no longer just a story about a single encounter. It was about an opportunity that had been offered, something that required thought, discussion, and trust. And her mother took the card gently, reading the name, recognizing it, and her expression changed slightly, reflecting the realization that this was something significant, something that could not be dismissed or taken lightly. And they sat down together, the conversation continuing in a more thoughtful way now, exploring what it could mean, what steps would need to be taken, how they could approach it carefully and responsibly. And Ava listened as much as she spoke, understanding that this was not just her decision alone, but something that would involve both of them moving forward together. And as they talked, the initial surprise gave way to a sense of cautious optimism, not built on assumptions, but on the understanding that this opportunity would require effort, communication, and clarity. And as the conversation settled, Ava felt a quiet sense of direction forming within her, not a complete plan, but the beginning of one, shaped by everything that had happened and everything that could follow. And while there were still questions to answer and steps to take, the uncertainty that once defined her perspective had shifted into something more stable, something that allowed her to look ahead with a sense of possibility that felt real, grounded, and within reach. The next morning arrived quietly, without any dramatic signal that something important was about to unfold. But Ava Johnson woke up with a different kind of awareness, the kind that does not come from a single thought, but from a shift that has already taken place deep inside. And as she sat up, her eyes moved instinctively toward the shoes placed carefully beside her bed. And for a moment, she simply looked at them, not with disbelief anymore, but with recognition, as if they had already become part of her story. And she reached for the card again, holding it in her hands as the events of the previous day returned with clarity, not as something distant, but as something still active, still shaping what came next. And when she joined her mother at the table, the conversation from the night before continued with a calmer tone, more focused, more deliberate, and together they reviewed what had been said, what had been offered, and what steps they would take. And there was no rush in their decision, only a shared understanding that this opportunity deserved attention and care. And later that day, with a steady sense of purpose, her mother made the call, not with expectation but with openness, ready to learn what this path might look like. And as the conversation unfolded, it became clear that everything William Carter had promised was real, structured, and respectful, a system designed to support without overwhelming, to guide without controlling. And over the following days, small steps began to take shape. Conversations with advisors, plans for school support, Opportunities that aligned with Ava's interests, each one building gradually, not in a way that felt sudden or unrealistic, but in a way that felt steady and earned. And through it all, Ava remained grounded, remembering the moment where it all began, not focusing on the crowd or the embarrassment, but on the choice that changed everything. The decision of one person to step forward instead of looking away, and that understanding stayed with her as she moved through each new experience, shaping how she approached challenges, how she saw herself, and how she interacted with others. And while her path was still unfolding, still filled with questions and effort, it was no longer defined by limitation. It was defined by possibility, and somewhere beyond the immediate changes, beyond the visible outcomes, there was a deeper shift taking place, one that could not be measured in material terms but could be felt in every decision she made, every step she took. And as time moved forward, the memory of that day did not fade. It became a reference point, a reminder that moments of change often arrive unexpectedly, and that what matters most is not just recognizing them, but choosing to act on them. Because in the end, it was never just about a pair of shoes. It was about being seen, being valued, and being given the chance to step into something greater. And that chance, once accepted, had the power to transform not only where she stood, but where she was going.